Good evening. On behalf of the Upstate New York Towns Association, I'd like to welcome everybody. We have school leaders and municipal leaders with us in person and also watching online. As municipal leaders, as school leaders, I know that we have dealt before with states of emergency for floods and other issues. This is the first time we've had to deal with a state of emergency because of a pandemic. And probably the hardest thing for us has been loss of lives and people sick. And that should be our greatest concern, and keeping people safe and healthy. But after that, there are economic results from it that we've had to deal with, that we're concerned about what's coming. So we look for a speaker that would be the most knowledgeable, and that speaker is E.J. McMahon. He's a senior fellow at the Empire Center in Albany that follows our finances on a daily basis. Love his title. His presentation is going to be Salvage the Damage, New York's Post-Pandemic Finances and Economy. EJ, it's yours.
Well, thank you very, very much, Carolyn, and hello, everyone. I can see you just as you can see me, so you can hear me, everybody? Okay, that's great. Um, yes, indeed, you have been through emergencies before, but nothing like this. In various titles, I've been following the finances of state and local government and public policy in New York for close to 45 years, starting way back as a newspaper reporter right out of college, and I certainly have never seen anything like this. This reminds me a bit of a story. Hemingway, one of Hemingway's novels, I think it was The Sun Also Rises. There was a character who was sort of a ne'er-do-well who was known to have gone bankrupt, and another character asked him, "How did you go bankrupt?" And the guy's answer was two ways: gradually and then all of a sudden. And that's a good description of any bankruptcy. It's also of any calamity. This one happened in reverse. It happened all of a sudden, and now the effects are going to play out gradually. I've got some slides to share with you that are meant strictly to illustrate some of the effects I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to flip to showing them on the screen now. And here we go. And you should be seeing that slide evoking what you've experienced. Can everybody see that? The locomotive falling off of the building there. That photo evokes what we've been through, and it gets to the title of my, which I think I reversed two words in from what I gave Carolyn, Surveying the Damage. There's very real damage. This is an economic crash, like a locomotive just running right off a building. What's the state of the economy? What's the state of the state's finances? And as you know, things flow downhill, and what affects the state as a whole ultimately affects local governments all over the state, even those that are relatively immune to the immediate consequences. The most immediate measure we always have, the most current measure we have of economic performance in New York or any state, is the current estimate of payroll employment. Comes out every month, the month after the month for which it's estimating. It's based on a very large sample of businesses, which is re-benchmarked once every year. And it's a pretty adequate count of the total number of jobs on payrolls in New York State. By the way, this data series that you hear and read about every month in the paper, these are jobs by where they are located. These are jobs, full-time and part-time jobs, by where they are located. So these are jobs in New York. And as you can see, we went on a 30-year run in which we had a pretty good net gain in employment. You see the shaded areas of that chart are the recessions. So we start out right before just past the beginning of the recession in the early 90s. There was a big loss there, more than 500,000 jobs, almost all of which, by the way, occurred downstate. Then we have a nice run-up and a steady economic expansion from 92 all the way to the end of the decade to 2000. Then there's another recession. By the way, 9/11 was only incidental in this recession. This was largely other causes. had to do with the dot-com boom especially. And the state lost over 300,000 jobs in that recession, again, mainly downstate. Then from '05 to 10, we have a big gain in employment, which is mainly downstate. Then in the Great Recession, we have another drop of 300,000 jobs in the Great Recession. That's a less severe job loss than most states. We had our Great Recession experience was not nearly as bad as that of the nation as a whole or some other states that were in the eye of the storm. That recession ends in 2009 or thereabouts, and for 10 years we're in an expansion with steadily climbing employment. By the way, if you notice, if you see the fine point at the right end of that chart, job growth had begun to slow down and stagger a bit the final months leading up to the pandemic. It wasn't dropping, but it was sort of jiggering up and down. But on the whole, across this period, we gained 1.6 million jobs total. These are private and public jobs across New York State. The overwhelming majority of that job growth, certainly since the early 2000s, well over 90% of the job growth was downstate, New York City and its suburbs, not upstate. You won't be surprised to hear that since you've already experienced that. Okay, so this chart is the picture up until February. If I was doing a briefing for you in February, this is what it looked like. Then comes the calamity. The locomotive falls off the building. This was previously just absolutely unimaginable that you would see something like this. In the space of a month, basically, we lost nearly 2 million jobs, nearly 1.9 million jobs, approaching 2 million, almost straight down from nearly 8.4 million jobs to just under 6.5 million jobs. On a month-to-month basis, well over 1 million jobs lost. Again, 1.8, 1.9 million jobs. Incredible. Never thought something like this was possible. We had not ever pictured experiencing something like this. Let's dig in a little and come close up and focus and see how the recovery has been. Remember all the talk early in the pandemic about the hopes for a V-shaped recovery? Well, the V-shaped recovery has not transpired, particularly in New York. And if you look at private sector payrolls and how they've been recovering since hitting bottom in April, it's looking like more of an L with each passing month. We quickly recovered in the first couple of months after the drop, but the job gain has slowed down. And through September, as of September, total private sector employment was still 1 million jobs lower than the same month a year earlier, which was down 12.1% from the September 2019 total. Now, if you compare us to the rest of the states, out of all 50 states, only one state, Hawaii, which has been just crushed because of its tourism economy, only one state has had a bigger drop in employment in the latest 12-month period than New York. New York is 12.1, Hawaii is almost 22%. We're by far the worst. Now, we did have the biggest initial drop because we had such a severe outbreak here, but the recovery also has been slow. Unemployment, the red line is the unemployment rate. Unemployment, as officially counted, statewide was well over 14% or 15% at the worst of the post-pandemic period. In the past month, it dropped a lot. It dropped from 12% and change to just under 10%. In September, according to official estimates. That was one of the biggest one-month decreases in the country. However, look at the blue line on that graph. That's employment. The unemployment rate decreased because not because the total number of people employed had increased. In fact, the total number of people reporting they were employed to the survey that creates the unemployment rate was actually down a bit in September. The unemployment rate in New York State is lower, and this is true in every region. The unemployment state is lower because discouraged workers aren't even describing themselves as looking for work. So the improvement is not as good as it looked on first notice. One last thing, this jagged chart here is 3 different regions. New York City New York City's downstate suburbs, and last but not least, upstate. By the way, I always consider upstate to be everything north of the MTA region, which goes up to the Mid-Hudson Valley, because once you get past the northern border of Dutchess and Orange, you're no longer paying taxes to the commuter rail system of New York City, and you're in a very distant situation and very few people commuting to New York City. So if you look there, that's the labor force. In the expansion up to the pandemic, New York City had falling unemployment and an increasing labor force. It had more people seeking work, a bigger labor force, and dropping unemployment. That's a nice place to be. The downstate suburbs were more in the middle. The labor force wasn't really increasing markedly. Unemployment was going down. So more people were finding work, but the labor force was not increasing. Upstate's labor force has been declining for pretty much the entire period since the end of the recession. Had just begun to level off and increase a bit before the pandemic, and now is dropping like a stone again. So the main challenge of the recovery period is going to not only be restoring and creating jobs, it's teasing people back into the labor market who've given up hope of having a job. Okay, this obviously had an impact on state tax revenues. These are the state's main taxes and a couple of its other revenue sources. If you read left to right, the first column is fiscal year 2020. And keep in mind, I think everybody knows this, but it's important to kind of get your mind ratcheted to this. The state's fiscal year is April 1 through March 31st. So when you see fiscal 20, that means the year that ended last March 31st, right after the pandemic began. So the state revenues, not including federal, the things that the state counts as its revenues, $86.5 billion, more than half of which is the personal income tax, as you can see. The governor's budget, as released in January and touched up a bit in February, projected that revenues for this year would rise to nearly $92 billion. What actually happened was revenues crashed. Revenues actually now, according to the latest governor's projection, are supposed to be down over $9 billion from last year's actual total. We've never, ever in a single year seen revenues drop by 11%, which is what $9 billion is. That's a very severe decrease in state revenues, all taking place basically all at once in the space of a month following the shutdown in March to deal with the spread of COVID. Now, you're going to hear a lot of confusing figures. You follow this more closely than most people. So perhaps you've been trying to make sense of just how bad the state situation is, because if you pay attention to news reports of what Governor Cuomo is saying, you have heard him reported as saying that we have, quote, a $14.5 billion deficit. Have you heard that one? $14.5 billion deficit? Well, we don't. That number is how much lower revenues are expected to be this year from what the governor projected before the pandemic. That's not a deficit. That's just the difference between those two numbers. You may also have heard we have a deficit of $60 billion. That is that number, $14.5 billion, meaning the difference between current projection and what was hoped for in January played out across 4 years. Well, we don't budget on a 4-year basis. We budget 1 year at a time. So it's impossible to have a $60 billion deficit. I'm not downplaying how bad the problem is, but it's important as we look ahead to know how bad it is, but not how much worse it is. So revenues are down $9.4 billion, according to the governor's projections, from a year ago. Now, by the way, one of your favorite topics locally, I just pulled this out of the comptroller's latest report, is sales taxes. That grid, that part on the right there is a mess, as you can see, monthly year over year, quarterly year over year. There's been some confusion about what is going on with sales taxes. They're up, they're down, they're higher in New York City than upstate, they're lower in New York City than upstate. What is happening? Well, what happens is the remittance of sales taxes to localities is based in part on estimates by the state based on the prior year experience and the general trend. and the usual ratio of a particular area to the state as a whole. What happened in March at the end of the first quarter was so unbelievable, so different, so atypical that the estimates were wrong, and they were too high for New York City and too low for upstate. And therefore, they've been doing some correcting in the remittances since the spring, since the first quarter. These are basically where things stand as of the most recent report then. In the third quarter, as you can see, New York City is down almost 22% in the third quarter. The Mid-Hudson Valley is up 3.6%. Long Island is basically the same. And then you see the upstate regions, and you see across there, Central New York up 5.7%. Southern Tier, which is the region in which you're located, down 0.1%. I'm not sure these are good economic indicators and whether they mean everything they seem to show. Certainly something that's going on in a lot of regions of the suburbs and exurbs of New York City, all the way to upstate, including the region you're in, is the movement, permanent or temporary, of downstaters to country homes and rural retreats, where they're ordering lots of stuff from Amazon, which is reflected in the tax base of the place where they're now living. So, and also if they're buying furnishings and appliances, that also feeds the sales tax in these regions. So that could be part of what's pumping up the numbers. What happened in the budget? Now, let's remember some calendar items. Does anybody remember exactly when you began to take seriously what you were reading about the pandemic? When did it start hitting the news, and did you start wondering, is this really going to hit us? I happen to be taking notes, and you may be like me. I'm not unduly alarmist, but I began writing this, so you can look at my website online. We began to see news reports that this was having serious effects on the global supply chain the last week in February. The last week in February, there were mounting concerns about the impact of the Wuhan virus on global supply chains, about a visible concerning spread to Europe and northern Italy. And the stock market in the final week of February had its worst week in many years and the quickest short-term correction. A correction is negative 10% in the stock indexes, the fastest in many decades. There was a steep drop in the stock market the final week of February, which was a turnaround from peak stock prices in mid-February. By the way, the state had its annual consensus revenue forecasting conference in the middle of that week. And if you look back on it, you'll see various economists expressing concern, something's happening. We don't know what the future will bring. Nonetheless, what was the consensus revenue forecast signed by representatives of the governor and the legislature that weekend, March 1st? Answer, they agreed there'd be hundreds of millions of dollars more in revenue than the governor had projected. This is right on the eve, basically, of the pandemic. So over the next month, quickly, very quickly, state officials and local officials see what's actually going on. So April 1st, almost 2 weeks into the shutdown, with the situation clearly really grim, very bad things happening, rising hospitalization and death toll, concerns that there's not going to be enough ventilators and enough hospital beds. Things are really looking bad. And clearly, this is in the depths of the lockdown. There's nothing but quote unquote essential businesses open. Everybody's in their house. The economy has absolutely come to a standstill. So New York had an early jump on doing its state budget. New York's fiscal year of April 1st is the earliest in the country. Almost every other state has a fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So how did that change the state's budget outlook? Well, what this bar chart shows is the governor had proposed a state budget of about $106 billion. April 1st and 2nd was when the votes were held by the legislature at triple arm's length, with hardly anybody in the chamber and members in their offices in Albany. The budget that was enacted was almost $106 billion. It was $105 billion. There was almost no change made significantly in the spending that Governor Cuomo had proposed, even in the teeth of this just terrible pandemic. What basically was the explanation for that? Basically, the governor said that, acknowledged that the budget seemed to be at least $10 billion short of what was needed, and that the federal government was going to have to make up that difference. Now, at that time, in his defense, the federal government had just passed the CARES Act, C-A-R-E-S Act, the third or fourth and largest of the stimulus bills hurriedly enacted in response to the crisis. It had lots of money and it was well over $1 trillion. It was the biggest such stimulus or emergency relief bill in history. And some of the money in there did flow to states and local governments. New York State directly received $5.5 billion from something called the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and $3 or $4 billion went to New York State localities for the same purpose, which was to deal with direct expenses produced by the coronavirus. In addition, the state received over $1 billion for K-12 education, particularly for Title I schools, which are those serving disadvantaged and low-income populations, which is why the state budget was $1 billion lower than the governor proposed, because $1 billion was offset by federal aid. School aid, in fact, was left unchanged. So we had received that bill, and all of the news reports at the time had suggested that there was going to be another stimulus bill right after Congress's Easter recess. It was considered imminent, practically a done deal, that Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi would agree on something. President Trump was giving off inconsistent signals. It was unclear what he thought. Some days he was for it, some days he was against it. But in any event, something seemed likely. What happened, however, was, to a surprise of a lot of people, what proceeded to happen was nothing. There was no agreement in late April or in May. In May, roughly late May, the House Democrats enacted something called the HEROES Act, all cap, an acronym spelling out HEROES, which was more than $3 trillion. $3 trillion. And it was an enormous laundry list of pet projects and programs favored by the Democratic majority in the House, including a massive $1 trillion state and local aid program, $500 billion of it guaranteed, of which New York State's share alone would have been $33 billion in largely unrestricted aid. That was the Democratic bargaining position through the summer. What happened basically was that politically, the erstwhile deficit hawks in the Senate Republican conference choked on that number, got dug in, refused to negotiate, refused in particular to do anything with aid to states and local governments, even though their own states, in fact, behind the scenes were clamoring for aid. And there was no agreement through the summer. Now, subsequently, Democrats, in an effort to negotiate, passed a modified version of the HEROES Act that was $2 trillion and change. And that position was being negotiated as recently as a month ago by Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. But the Senate Republicans were unwilling to do anything but a much smaller bill that offered only business relief and an extended unemployment insurance. And that's where things stood at the time of the election. So keep that number in mind. What's the state shortfall? Well, here's a way to think about it. This is all actual and projected all funds tax receipts as of the time the budget was proposed. Now, if anybody managing a budget knows, you want spending and receipts to match. Preferably, you'd rather have receipts outrun spending and build up a reserve. But at the very worst, you don't want spending to exceed receipts. So if you look through here, through fiscal 2021, in the budget the governor proposed, the budgets were going to be balanced. That is, state taxes and other revenues were going to equal state operating fund spending. That was what the governor's plan. If I took this back to 2011, it would show the same thing. Balanced budgets. The out years, the future projected years, starting next year, they had these relatively small gaps of $2 to $3 billion. That's not atypical. And the governor would be closing those gaps through other steps in the future. Before the pandemic. Happened after the pandemic. Note the blue line. The spending line is still going up. Nothing has happened to bring that spending line down. That is 4 years worth of spending, including the year we're in. Nothing has happened to bring that line down. These are the official numbers. What's gone down, what has basically collapsed, is the receipts line, the red line. Receipts have collapsed, and next year's budget gap, the difference between revenues and expenditures projected for fiscal 21-22, which begins April 1st, is $16.7 billion by the governor's estimate. That is the biggest budget gap in history in absolute terms and as a percentage of the net state operating funds budget, which is now, as I noted earlier, a little over $100 billion. The gap is projected at $16.7 billion. Now, a little good news. Based on actual experience today, we're now halfway through the fiscal year. Comptroller DiNapoli has projected that the gap will be smaller because without even counting any likely changes in spending, which will occur, receipts, he says, are headed $3.8 billion higher than the governor had projected this year and $4 billion higher next year and about $4 billion higher the year after that. So that's some positive news. That takes that 16.7 down to 12.6 without even touching spending. So it means it's really bad, but not quite as bad. Where do we stand now? Then there's this little space in here. How much, I spoke earlier about that $14.5 billion number you always hear. And again, you hear various numbers. What is the actual budget shortfall in the state budget right now? What is it? Well, based on the official numbers, if you know how to read them, it actually is about $8 billion, according to the governor's numbers. According to the comptroller's tax receipts estimate, which we have every reason to believe is more correct, it's more like the actual gap is probably more like $4 billion. That's still pretty big for more than halfway through the fiscal year. But there are things we don't know. The state got that $5 billion in CARES Act relief for coronavirus expenses. Over the summer, the Trump administration repeatedly put out guidance documents that essentially invited states to define as much spending as they felt comfortable with into that eligibility for that funding. If it was related in any way to the coronavirus, the spending could be sort of attributed to the coronavirus. I think the state began to do that, and there's an unacknowledged degree to which several $billion in state spending relief actually will be created by that. In addition, last but not least, there's the issue of, well, will there be state relief? Will there be state and local aid under a stimulus bill? If there is, all New York needs for this year, I think, is more like $4 billion, if that. Oh, one last thing. The governor had a couple of special provisions put in this year's budget to help him deal with the uncertainty of the pandemic. So while spending in the budget wasn't reduced at all, and the budget had an enormous built-in deficit at the start, the legislature passed a provision giving the governor unprecedented authority to unilaterally make across-the-board cuts in local aid as necessary to deal with revenue shortfalls. Thus, when you kept hearing him threaten to cut school aid by 20%, and when you saw him actually withhold different amounts of local aid, including signaling a refusal to reimburse a certain amount of CHIPS local highway payments, which is relevant to many towns, I know. He was doing that pursuant to that budget authority. Those are not permanent actual cuts. They are withholds, freezes, delays that he would not normally have done, except he's able to do under that provision of the law. He also got special permission. He has authorization to borrow up to $11 billion, initially short-term, rolled over next year into another round of short-term, and then turned into long-term deficit borrowing. He used $4.5 billion of that authorization because tax day this year, you'll recall, was changed from April 15th to July 15th, and the state's cash flow is affected. So he did $4.5 billion in borrowing. Okay, the cash flow picked up when the taxes were filed. We still have the $4.5 billion. That's why the state doesn't actually have right now a cash flow crisis, because it has that money it borrowed, which was then made up in the tax payment season, which it's presently says it's going to redeem at the end of the fiscal year. But right now, it's there. So that's why you don't see a panic. You hear these large numbers tossed around and you wonder, how are they not making permanent cuts? Why is the state not running out of cash? That's the reason. Okay, and meanwhile, the governor has been waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping and assuming that there would be two things would occur. One would be that Joe Biden would be elected president, but not just that, that Democrats would take over both houses of Congress in a blue wave. Now, in his defense, all of the polls showed that as increasingly likely throughout the fall. And so that was what he was waiting for. Also, until the last month of the campaign, it was thought that President Trump was so anxious to get another stimulus bill done that would include additional rebate checks to families that the Senate would feel compelled to help him and do that. They didn't. It didn't happen. And right now, there's no aid on the horizon. What's the deal now nationally? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. If you've got a budget gap this big in the state budget, how do you close it? Well, here's the pie chart. And remember, the state budget is just over $100 billion, so that's convenient. It makes it easy for you to think about how big the figures are. Half of that $100 billion plus budget, over $50 billion of that budget, is in just two categories: school aid and what's called DOH Medicaid, the core of the Medicaid program, the state share, not including the local share or federal revenues, the state-funded share of Medicaid. Those two items are over half of the budget, and the biggest of all is school aid. The state's own agency operations are just below 20%. So if you want to save money in the state budget, the first place you go are those three items. And frankly, the main place that governors have always gone through repeated fiscal crises is school aid. School aid is the one spigot over the sink that governors can turn up and down and off and on and instantly achieve increases or savings. Historically, in a fiscal crisis, in a pinch, governors always cut school aid. It's the main choice. The math always dictates that, and school aid is as big, if not bigger, a share of the budget now as it's ever been. So anything that is done to deal with that shortfall, the first reductions in spending trends and current spending will be in school aid. The only question is how, not whether. When the time comes to cut, school aid is first on the block. Medicaid, which is second biggest, is always more difficult, not just because of the politics of Medicaid, but because Medicaid is a multi-level federal entitlement program. It's highly complicated. It is very difficult if you target a level of spending in Medicaid. If you want to save $1 billion on Medicaid, it's very difficult. It's like taking the marble out of the meat. It can be done, but it takes a while and it's complicated. And there's so many moving parts in Medicaid, it's easy to thwart any major effort to reform the program and save money in a hurry. School aid, you want to cut $1 billion, all you do is tweak a couple of parts of the formula and presto, you're spending $1 billion less. Medicaid is much more complicated. And the governor already had a problem with Medicaid spending, which was running way over budget before the pandemic. That leaves all the rest. You can't reduce debt service. You can't reduce pensions and health insurance. You can reduce health insurance in the long run. Pensions, you have to make the contribution in New York. That's why we're not as bad off as Illinois, because the courts have not allowed governors and legislatures to chronically shortchange the pension system. It's not legal. And then you have all these other items are what you have left. And they don't add up collectively. What they add up to require massive cuts. And again, debt service, you can't even cut, really. State agency operations, you can target for cuts of 10 or 15%. It would have effects, and there will be fights over which areas it affects. But this is the pie that you need to shrink in order to close gaps of any significant size. Okay. So here's the big questions, and here's what we're facing in trying to decide how serious the Reconstruction situation is. How much state and local aid will be in the next federal stimulus bill? There will be a stimulus bill. You know the politics, I think, as well as anybody. What we're now hanging on is a special election for 2 U.S. Senate seats in Georgia, which will determine which party controls the U.S. Senate for the next 2 years. The House Democratic majority, contrary to all poll predictions, is going to be significantly smaller, affording the Speaker much less of a cushion and maneuvering room for her priorities. If the Senate is Republican, all of the major Democratic program priorities will be in suspended animation for the period that the Republicans still hold the majority. There will be negotiations. The Republicans will have to negotiate programs with the president, but a lot of his priorities won't be done. However, Mitch McConnell said the day after the election and ever since then, he has suddenly begun stressing that he feels there needs to be another coronavirus relief bill, a stimulus bill. The reason why is fairly apparent. He has two members running in a special runoff election, both on January 5th. That's an important date to remember, January 5th. And he would like to have them running as people who have just voted in favor of another round of stimulus, including extended unemployment, small business relief, and liability relief. That will be the next chance Democrats have, with, I think, President-elect Biden playing a role to get state and local aid into the bill. It won't be as much as the biggest Democratic bill would have given New York. It may not be as little as Republicans might have been willing to do for a few moments in midsummer. It would probably be something. What will the budget reductions and tax hikes be that the governor is willing to consider to make up the rest? This is another political point to be made. The Senate Democrats in New York did not capture a supermajority necessary to override the governor's budget vetoes and essentially make him irrelevant to the budget process. Many results are unsettled because of the large number of absentees, but it seems apparent that there will be no net increase in the number of Democrats in the New York State Senate, which means they're still 2 votes short of a supermajority, which means the governor's power to control spending and to draw the line on spending, which is the first and foremost power that the governor has, is going to remain there as long as he has Senate Republican members on his side, and he cannot be overridden. So that's an important part of the budgetary dynamic. That means that whatever is left, if anything, to do in the way of budget cuts next year to deal with whatever the difference is between stimulus aid and the huge shortfall in revenues, it's going to be up to the governor to set the terms of the debate and to decide whether it's all spending or partly spending or what the mix is of spending reductions, financing, and new revenues, if any. Will there be adjustments to capital financing? There should be. Will there be more deficit borrowing? There should not be, except as a last resort with pretty stringent conditions. So again, the big variable is January 5th. If the governmental partnership starts with President Biden and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, you're going to see a federal stimulus package in the neighborhood of $2.5 to $3 trillion, I would predict, including all of the elements we saw in the previous package: extended unemployment insurance, small business aid, a liability shield maybe, that's more of a Republican priority, and generous state and local aid. I would say New York State in that eventuality gets probably something in the neighborhood, just at the state level, of something like $15 billion in the type of package that, and maybe 20, in the type of package that I think congressional Democrats as a majority would enact under President Biden if they had majorities in both houses. So no matter how big that number is, that's only temporary budget relief. That's putting off the problem for another year or two, which is what we saw with the Obama-era stimulus and what we will see with whatever the next stimulus bill delivers. By the way, President Biden is also committed, probably not effective until the second year he's in office, to a very substantial federal tax hike that would have an especially heavy impact on the type of very high earners and financial market investors and market participants who are clustered in New York and who are the biggest portion of our tax base. So that has ramifications for us. And there's a lot of other programs, including an expansion of Obamacare, various environmental measures, including not the Green New Deal, but Green New Deal type initiatives, and a pronounced programmatic hostility to, for instance, fossil fuel investments and expansions. Now, on the other hand, if the Senate remains in Republican hands, which which requires President Biden to negotiate with Mitch McConnell, you'll see a federal stimulus package. This is just my prediction, and my expectation, like the governor's, was completely wrong over the summer. However, I think the dynamic really means that there will be a stimulus package much smaller, in the low trillions, 1 to 2 trillion, maybe 1.8 trillion if Republicans need to agree to that much. And it would include small business aid, expanded unemployment, the liability shield for sure. That's something that Republicans have made a priority, and some state and local aid, because the Democrats and President Biden won't, or President-elect Biden, if it's done in a lame duck session, will not want to do a package that has nothing for state and local governments in it. In that case, New York might be in for, my guesstimate, $8 billion total for the state to $10 billion maybe. Again, that would then make it unnecessary to roll over the short-term debt. It would fill part of this year's deficit and part of next year's deficit, but would mean there'd still be pressure sooner to reduce spending further. That would not be an immediate pain-free. It wouldn't put off the pain, all of the pain, for another year or two. It would mean that decisions have to be made starting in next year's budget to reduce spending, including spending in all the areas that affect everybody in this room. There wouldn't be any significant federal tax hike as long as the Senate is in Republican hands. There probably, by the way, will be some major infrastructure deal. They were not able to come to an agreement under President Trump. Probably the one priority that President Biden has that Senate Republicans would largely support, not entirely, would be, along with the House Democrats, would be some sort of infrastructure deal. That would ultimately have ripple effects, obviously, on local governments in upstate New York and all over the country in some way or another. So meanwhile, what are the ideas for raising revenues in New York State? Well, right now there have been outspoken groups of urban progressives in New York State, mostly urban. This is their website, which mysteriously has gone down, which was up for like 6 months. This illustration pretty much exhibits not only the hope, but the tone of the campaign for higher taxes. And this is not just a fringe group. This is basically a core of Democrats in both houses want the program illustrated here. They, in fact, say that there's 14 different ways to tax the rich and balance the budget. By the way, all of these ideas were cooked up or were being cooked up before the pandemic. They favored these ideas in addition to the taxes that were expected from a slowly growing economy before the pandemic. And now they've redoubled efforts in this direction with the excuse that the pandemic makes it essential, that there should be no spending cuts, whatever, but instead there should be these proposals enacted. And there's a whole bunch of different proposals, including an actual wealth tax, which happens to be explicitly unconstitutional on the state level in New York, but is nonetheless being promoted. That would be imposed only on billionaires, as defined by Forbes magazine, and various other increases in taxes aimed at very high earners, millionaire earners, and the rich by different definitions. That's going to be a battleground because the people who are advocating that before the election are still going to be advocating it. The governor is going to be feeling pressure from his left in reaction to any spending restraint he proposes at any level, and was already getting heat on this in February before the pandemic. Why aren't you taxing the rich? There's going to be more pressure in this direction. We can discuss that if you want to, but I won't go through all of the different ideas. But this is going to be very loudly and persistently advocated as we get into a session next year if it requires any kind of fiscal restraint on the part of the governor. One thing to keep in mind, if there was any new federal tax or increase in federal individual rates, that's going to change taxpayer behavior. And there are many, many studies over the years that show this and demonstrate, including one very data-rich study done in California just last year. When you make significant changes to marginal rates on high-income earners, you have significant changes on their behavior that are designed to reduce their exposure to those taxes. That's just not just common sense, that's documented experience. That would tend to have an effect that will erode our tax base. Any further increase aimed at New York State's highest earners is going to compound the negative effect of the federal SALT deduction cap, which has already raised the effective tax rate in New York to its highest level in history, far beyond where it's ever been compared to lower no tax states. Now, you might wonder, well, we're here in the Southern Tier. We don't have large numbers of extremely wealthy people around here. The state's finances are more dependent than ever at any time in their history, full stop, period, on high earners. We are more dependent on the income tax, which is roughly 2/3 of total taxes, and over 40% of the income tax pre-pandemic was coming from the highest earning 1% of New York residents. Not only that, if you go beyond New York residents, consider the fact that we were getting from commuters from New Jersey to jobs in New York, just those commuters were paying $3 billion in taxes to New York State. Those taxes were not going to subsidize amenities, transit, et cetera, in New York City where they worked. For all intents and purposes, given the flow of funds in New York, the $3 billion in taxes paid to New York State by commuters from New Jersey, most of them well paid, was put on a barge and sent up the Hudson River and redistributed across upstate New York, including to your school districts, counties, villages, et cetera, in whatever form of aid they get. So the state's tax base is very much in jeopardy in the long term, depending on the extent to which this pandemic causes behavioral changes in the way people work and where they're located. So we're in a pretty chancy, dicey situation here. This is just a link addresses to our website, but it's empirecenter.org. And this final illustration, which I've used before, is if one positive I would say is that we're in the bottom of the hole looking up. I don't think we go any lower. The question is how quickly and how well can we somehow get a foothold and climb back up toward the light there. This is going to be a long, slow recovery, I think. It's always, predictions are chancy, but I think everybody predicts it's going to be a slow recovery. The job base is not expected to recover to previous levels for 3 years or more in New York. That does not sound unreasonable. So there's many challenges here. I'd like to close with just discussing a couple of priorities that I think need to be part of how the state answers this challenge. And we began writing this at the Empire Center. I began writing about this in February and March. One absolute prerequisite for reducing spending at the state and local level in New York is a statutory freeze on all public sector wages, all wages. That is base pay and contractual step increments. The state has the power to do this by statute. That power was initiated for the first time during the 1975 New York City fiscal crisis and has repeatedly been upheld against legal challenges by unions in state and federal courts repeatedly over the past 45 years, most recently a year or two ago in the case of a wage freeze that had been imposed in Nassau County. We estimated that if a wage freeze had been imposed earlier this year, looking ahead, the savings at every level of government in New York, including some major public authorities, would have come to roughly $2 billion. $2 billion less would be spent with no measurable effect on services, simply a suspension of pay increases for some of the nation's best paid public employees. That still has to be an option. School districts outside New York City, and I know there's school people in the room, if you do the math, how much of your projected spending increase this year and next is for contractual pay hikes, including steps protected by the Triborough Amendment? Well, even if they're contractual, they can be suspended. And that means after a year or two, whenever the freeze is listed, you don't make retro pay. It's suspended for that period, and the pay increases resume when the emergency period is over. That was done in Buffalo, for instance, in their fiscal crisis, and upheld by a federal court against challenge by the teachers union. That has to be a prerequisite for getting out of this hole. You can't get out of this hole without reducing spending. And it's harder to reduce spending if you feel committed to increase it on the single biggest item of expense in municipal budgets, certainly in school budgets, which is personnel. So that's the one thing I would stress above all others is a start. All by itself, it doesn't fix the problem. But for instance, if next year's budget has to include a cut of up to say $2 billion in school aid, it would be much better or much easier to absorb that or less difficult to absorb that if schools were in the process of also saving $750 million on salary and wage step increases. That's one big change I would advocate. There are many other ways to discuss it, but I think I'll stop right there, Carolyn, and you can kind of tell me if you'd like to start asking, and I'll entertain questions. Mic's on?
Is the mic on?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Is
Is there anyone
here that would like to ask questions?
Thanks, Carolyn. And thank you for that incredible presentation. And certainly is giving me a lot of thought. My head is spinning. I'm Tanya Thompson, the proud superintendent of the Binghamton City School District. And where, as a small city school district, fiscally struggling, this threat of 20% right now, moving forward is about $12.5 million for our district. One of the components of the budget that I have been talking to legislators about is, accepting the inevitable cuts, whatever they may be, but to advocate for equity within those cuts. That 20% across the board is far from equity, and our governor has preached a commitment to equity. I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of its reality or conversation that may be happening around that.
Well, 20% across the board was a scare tactic. I'm getting a little echo on my end because when that mic's on, I hear it twice. But anyway, 20% across the board cut was a scare tactic on the governor's part, aimed to get everybody motivated to ring the phones off the hook in Congress. By the way, I'm not sure why anybody assumed that anyone in Congress who was holding up stimulus was going to feel more motivated to do it because people from New York were demanding it. I mean, if you think about that for a minute, that's what, Chuck Schumer isn't enough? I mean, that, and you'll note, I don't know if you saw this a few months ago, some schools began making such cuts. Albany School District began doing cuts,
We did as well.
and they were reprimanded by the state budget director. Hey, what are you doing? You shouldn't do that. And of course, their reaction naturally was, what are you talking about? You told us you were going to cut 20%. Well, they were not really going to cut 20%. In fact, by the way, the $8 billion hole, and if you look at the state financial plan, there's a line that says, budget reduction. And it's a lump sum. It's like all the normal numbers. And then it says budget reduction, $8 billion. That's been, $8 billion is the purported possible reduction in local aid. That's not 20%. It's 12%. So number one. Number two, the reason if he made any cut, if in an emergency he had to make any cut, it would have to be across the board, is because his authority to cut local aid, which governors don't have authority to cut mid-year otherwise, is a special provision, is only across the board. If he made such a cut, and the reason why he has not yet made any permanent cut is A, he doesn't feel it necessary yet. B, if he did, it would trigger the legislature's ability to come back within a given period of time and propose and enact something different. Not only do it differently, but to do it by a joint resolution, which the governor can't veto. So this is not quite what you thought it was. What the withholding of your September aid followed by the non-withholding of your October aid, that's all part of a mix of sort of scare tactic and performance art aimed at influencing, getting everybody constantly saying to everybody they see, including your local congressman, if he happens to be a Republican, hey, we need that local, although again, the House has voted on this, so it's not much that, Tom Reed's going to do. And in fact, he leads a bipartisan coalition that has proposed something with local aid in it. So, but does the governor need to cut 20% from your school aid this year, or will he? The answer is no. No and no. That's not going to happen this year. However, if and a mid-year cut in school aid is highly unlikely. Next year, what he did in his first year, and he had to do it, and it's commended, and he should be, and I commended him at the time for doing. He did what had to be done when he took office. He inherited a big budget gap because the stimulus aid from the Obama stimulus had run out right when he took office, which meant that a floor under state school aid had dropped away. So, in fact, there was a net reduction of well over $1 billion in school aid that year, which was about 6%. That was done in a quasi-fair way. If you were involved in a school, then it wasn't completely equitable, but it was quasi-equitable. It wasn't across the board. I totally agree with you. It would be totally unfair now. Whatever cut is made in school aid should be targeted mainly at the schools that can most afford to make up for it in their own tax base, which also are the schools that pay the most gratuitously enormous salaries downstate to their very well-heeled teachers. And it should be also accompanied by significant mandate relief at every level, including but not limited to the wage freeze I mentioned. Because if you think of the dynamic here, it doesn't matter, and everybody here who's dealt with a union knows this. If you say to your union, listen, we need concessions or we're going to need to lay off 10% or 20% of your members, their answer will be, yeah, well, go do what you got to do. Or it'll be, wait a minute, we have another idea, and that other idea will be pay very handsome severance packages to our senior members, which will cost you money, and that'll be fine. Genuinely, and this is historic, unions don't exist to give up stuff. They just do, and it's not because they're bad, it's because just functionally they don't do that in terms of their own politics. Again and again in the entire history of New York State, even when backed up against a wall by the threat of bankruptcy, unions do not make significant concessions unless management has leverage. Leverage is saying, listen, I have here a law that says I'm not paying you any raises for 2 years. If you guys want to see any raises, you're going to have to come to the table and find another way to help me save blank. If what Binghamton's looking at in pay hikes over the next 2 years, I'm just guessing, by the way, is $700,000. They have to come and say, well, we have another way to save $700,000, and you can then stipulate that it really does save $700,000. That the state has to do that for you, plus the reforms that your organization, I know, has advocated in terms of mandate relief to make it easier for you to save money on your health insurance and other benefit programs, transportation, and on and on and on. These things have constantly been sidetracked when they've been on the verge of being done. In the case of the Great Recession was because, fortunately and unfortunately, it didn't last quite long enough to keep up the pressure to make those things happen. But I totally agree with you, and it was very unfair to even imply that there would be across-the-board cuts of 20%, affecting school districts that rely on state aid for 60 or 70% of their budgets, the same as, say, Scarsdale, which, because our school aid formula actually is pretty equitable and redistributive, rich districts would feel very little pain from that, and you would be gouged. So there's going to be action on that front. I think what I made plain, and what I think you already know, is there's going to be, sooner or later, no more than a year or two from now, most likely in the coming months, there's going to be significant repeated reductions in school aid. Question is how big and how soon. I think it would have been better, frankly, if this, although it was a very tough period with a lot going on, I think many school officials that I talked to behind the scenes were ready in the spring when the budget was done. We're thinking, oh, aid's going to be cut now. But it wasn't cut. In fact, you were essentially invited to just go on as you were, which was really a huge mistake. You lost basically a year. You haven't been making changes. All districts that I know of have done what they could, knowing what's coming. But basically what was done with school aid, which was essentially nothing, was basically inviting schools to simply do business as usual till we figure out what we're doing. I don't think that did anybody a favor in the long run.
I don't want to monopolize.
Are there any questions from the municipalities?
I just have, hello, Mr. McMahon. Thank you very much. Jason Van Fossen, Superintendent, Maine Endwell Central School District in Broome County as well, neighbor
Hi.
with Tanya. Question regarding the statutory wage freeze that you mentioned at the very end, which you had mentioned as a priority.
Right.
Could you just go into a little more detail on that?
Well, as you know, and it would make sense if you thought, well, wait a minute, it's contractual. How can I not do what a contract requires? In the 1970s, in 1975, the state enacted the Financial Emergency Act for New York City. The Financial Emergency Act for New York City included provisions, a statutory provision. Following a finding, by the way, crucially, there was a finding carefully laid out and explained at the beginning of the preamble of the bill. The legislature hereby finds that there's an emergency, and descriptions based in fact to explain the emergency that existed at that time in New York City. Therefore, in light of this, we are doing these things, and these things was creating the Financial Control Board and other things, but these things included, we're freezing all wages and step increments, wages in steps. Now, at that time, a couple of the city's major unions had just agreed with Mayor Beam to do that. So it was sort of codifying something some unions had agreed to do and others had not yet agreed to do. And it was basically making them all live by that rule. It was lifted within 2 years in that case, because other events transpired after that. That's when the city, you recall, was functionally control boards and things like a control board created for other localities, including Erie County, most notably of relevance, say, to Binghamton, Buffalo, city of Buffalo. Also, most recently, Nassau County. In each of those cases, control boards froze wages pursuant to state law. In Nassau County, and the Buffalo teachers had, and particularly because they were pretty recalcitrant about dealing with the city during the control period, they got no pay raise for quite a few years. They used to be among the highest paid teachers in their region, and their whole wage schedule, the entire grid, which I know in your case is like 20 or 25 steps and multiple columns, right? That whole grid was frozen for a number of years. They went to court not by no means the first union to do it, in the early 2000s, to challenge the constitutionality of the control board law in Buffalo that froze their wages and their pay structure. It was upheld. Same thing, another challenge, it was landed in federal court and was decided, I think, last year in appeals. In Nassau County, the PBA, the very well-paid Police Benevolent Association in Nassau County, their wages were their steps and wages were frozen for a number of years. They went to court. They challenged it as an unconstitutional impairment of contract. They lost. It's absolutely clear that if the legislature, acting and together with the governor signing it, finds that there is a situation that amounts to an emergency, justifying a use of their emergency police powers to contravene normal standards, that they can put a halt on any pay raise that, crucially, that hasn't occurred yet. All right, so if you're scheduled to do a pay hike July 1st for teachers, and the legislature has enacted in the budget on April 1st a law that says everything's frozen till further notice, you therefore don't have to pay it. And they could do that. Now, let me make a practical political observation. That type of action would happen or be considered only if initiated by the governor. That's not the type of thing that emerges from legislators. There might be a brave, hardy soul in the backbenches somewhere in the legislature who's willing to say such a thing. In fact, something that surprises people when I tell them, in 2010 or 2011, maybe it was 2010, John Flanagan, who was then the Senate Education Committee chairman, not yet majority leader, he proposed a 1-year freeze in all teacher salaries in 2010. That's how bad the Great Recession had created so much tension and unhappiness at that point that a Republican senator from Long Island, John, was actually proposing it then. However, practically speaking, something like this won't happen unless Governor Cuomo initiates it, I think. The question is, will he? Let me add one thing on that, by the way, because there's so many managers in the room. You can structure this so that basically it creates a freedom for a union to come to you and say, look, we don't like this pay freeze. And like, as I said before, you can write the law so that it says, or it has words to the effect of, or similar savings, that the union has agreed to concede to, but you need to save that amount of money permanently, not just temporarily, because again, as I stressed, this is a suspension freeze. This is not freeze and we'll give you retro, in 2 years. It just stops time, which is what happened to Buffalo teachers, because they didn't want to settle and they thought maybe they could ultimately win, and they didn't.
Hello. I got a quick question for you on investors, small investors with rentals. Like they have tenants that the governor keeps extending, where the tenants don't pay and people are having a tough time making their mortgage payments, and a lot of us, including myself, we just fall in that category where we have to borrow money to pay our school taxes that we're due.
Right.
Nobody's talking about the small investor. They don't fall in any category.
I know what you're getting at, and by the way, I'm remiss because I was so focused on the public finances here. We didn't talk about the economic priorities and the fixes that the state needs to be sensitive to. I don't need to tell you that uptown main streets are now composed largely of temporarily or permanently shuttered small businesses, so that a lot of small investors may have an up and down situation where they have a mixed, where they've got a retail downstairs and an apartment upstairs or beside, and they're doubly affected. They're affected the way you describe, and they're affected because the pizzeria went out of business, or actually takeout food, it probably didn't, but if it was somebody's little dress shop, it's gone. So this is a complication, and the state needs to be much more sensitive to the economic impact of these policies on a stressed economy. And I know that you didn't mention this comes on the heel of the rent control law, which didn't impose rent control on you, but in some of the state's larger urban markets, partly because of actually other building and regulatory policies, has created a cloud of the possibility of rent control over potential investments in apartments in many areas on top of all of this. So yes, there needs to be much greater sensitivity to what these restrictions on evictions and on rent extensions, expirations has caused. Let me mention another thing. You're still scheduled to pay another phase of a minimum wage increase starting next year. The state has by law, the governor has the ability to suspend that. Last year, they put out a report, the Budget Division issued a report to justify an increase that rested entirely on how the unemployment rate was low and hadn't gone up. Therefore, there should be an increase in the minimum wage. Well, I don't need to tell you what's happened to unemployment and employment since then. If there ever was a situation that justified not raising the minimum wage in areas that were stagnant and struggling to begin with, this is that situation. That's another way in which the state needs to be sensitive to the economic distress that's been caused by the pandemic.
EJ, we want to thank you very much. It's been very informative, and we all learned a lot, and we know you gave a lot of your time to help us, and we thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and if anybody there, thank you. If anybody there wants any more information or wants to pursue any questions, if they can get in touch with you, Caroline, and then reach out to me via email, I'll be happy to continue the discussion.
Okay, thank you and good evening.